1915. For the soldiers on the Western Front, the new year brings stalemate. In the months since World War I began, the invading German army has failed to break through. Now it faces the British and French allies along a front line of trenches across France and Belgium. For nearly 4 years, these men will engage in the bitterest fight the world has ever known. These years will bring an appalling new weapon, poison gas, a new illness, shell shock, an extraordinary force, the mind. And these years will produce a new and deadly expression, going over the top.
It is a soldier's duty to charge against barbed wire into almost certain death. Often no one comes back.
If any man tells you he went over the top and he wasn't scared, he's a damn liar.
The trench warfare on the Western Front will bring unprecedented horror. And now, thanks to new computer technology, we will see it the way these men saw it themselves, in color. As 1915 began, the question for the French Supreme Commander, Joseph Joffre, and his British allies was how to break the stalemate on the Western Front. The German army was encamped in French and Belgian territory and facing the Allies along a 475-mile line of trenches.
You couldn't just stand there and wait forever. Something had to be done. The Germans, on the whole, were more or less content to sit there and say, okay, you move us, you kick us out, we're staying. And so it was up to the Allies to try and break through this great logjam. The essence of the Western Front War until 1918 was attempt after attempt, mostly failures, 1 or 2 successes here and there, to break that logjam.
The spring of 1915 saw the Allies' first concerted attempt to break the deadlock. But commanders on both sides were soon to be confronted with the hazards of trench warfare. One was communications, which initially were only possible through the courage of individual runners.
In the course of a battle, it is often necessary to send a runner with a message under circumstances which involve certain death or wounding. Yet never have I seen one of these carefully chosen men waver or hang back. No matter how dangerous the errand, the runner on duty never wants calling twice. He will pick up his rifle and be off, often to his death.
It might take hours for a message to travel little more than a few hundred yards. And that, of course, meant that by the time the general received the information and tried to act upon it, the situation on the front line had changed dramatically. And this is one of the major handicaps that commanders of the First World War had to contend with.
It was in this fog of war that the major offensives of 1915 began. The Allies devised a two-pronged operation to push back the Germans. The French would attack at Artois, while 20 miles along the line, the British would attack simultaneously at Festubert.
British and French High Command had come to believe that one more big push in the spring would break through the German trenches and reopen mobile warfare on the Western Front. But the battles fought at Festubert and in Artois in May 1915 simply showed that that was not going to happen, that the war was going to go on. And the British realised that their army simply was not big enough to sustain losses on this scale in this sort of warfare.
The campaign of spring 1915 took a devastating toll. The Allies suffered hundreds of thousands, killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. The British had traditionally had a small standing army. Their strength was in their navy. But the recruiting campaign masterminded by Lord Kitchener was producing a new mass of soldiers. To the professional soldier, these recruits presented an astonishing sight.
The British civilian had taken over the war. Many of the straight-spined old soldiers looked askance at the civilian warrior, and indeed the civilian under arms presented many a strange sight to our conservative eyes. He was undersized, he slouched, he was bespectacled. He wore uniform in a careless way. He saluted awkwardly and was very clumsy with his weapons. The old army was distinctly queasy about the future.
Kitchener's men saw their first significant action in September 1915 at the Battle of Loos. The aim, in collaboration with French forces to the south, was to break through German lines. But it turned into the standard pattern of battle: artillery bombardment, followed by infantrymen going over the top, followed by slaughter.
The ground was sprinkled with dead and dying heroes, but we had no time to stop and look at them, and soon got used to those ghastly faces. Many lay as they fell, and one actually had a letter in his hand, as though he had managed to read it through before he died.
Loos was the first time a large British army took very heavy casualties in one battle, some 43,000. The British responded by appointing a new commander-in-chief, Douglas Haig. The slaughter on the Western Front had only just begun. As the war stretched into its second year, hundreds of thousands of men from different nations headed for the front line and its unfamiliar terrors. One dominated, going over the top.
It is utterly impossible to describe one's feelings during the hours waiting for 0 hour. The mind is full of wild thoughts which are utterly beyond control. Recollections of friends and dear ones, places we have seen and known, and different phases of life all seem to pass in review before one's eyes.
We lived absolutely from 1 minute to the other, not knowing whether it would be our last or not. And that was the atmosphere that we lived in the trenches.
They had to just wait and listen for the order, because discipline was so great that all they had to do was to wait to listen for orders and obey them immediately. And everyone was ready and waiting for the order to go over.
We must lose a lot more men, but the men are only too willing to take their chance. It makes me awfully proud to belong to a nation who, when they're warned for a show like this, knowing what it means, cheer and start singing and whistling.
I always said a prayer. You know that some of the lads used to laugh at me. But I always to ask God to let me fight like a man and bring back safe and sound.
If any man tells you he went over the top and he wasn't scared, he's a damn liar. Because you never knew from 1 minute to the next whether that dark angel was around with your number on a label.
The men being sent to the front were nothing without their weapons and the artillery that was supposed to support them. But the endless pounding was bringing with it a crisis of supply.
Before the First World War, the British Army was a standing army of only about 200,000 men. Now our armaments industry was only geared up to provide uniforms, equipment and weapons for 200,000 men. In fact, when Haig takes command, he says, we will not be able to fight a major offensive action until the middle of 1917, because he knew that until then we were never going to have heavy industry to provide us with enough guns and shells and the ability to fight that campaign any earlier.
The answer was a huge mobilization of women to work in the munitions factories. Handling explosives was unpleasant, dirty and dangerous.
It was all bright ginger. All our front hair and all our faces were bright yellow. This doctor was looking at us all one day, and he said, half you girls will never have babies, God help you.
Some of them suffered very badly. They were known as the canaries because the handling TNT, explosives, made their skin go yellow. Some of them really suffered appallingly.
Stained hands and coppery hair. What are these? Do we fear temporary disfigurement when men for the same cause are facing death, and not permanent disfigurement of maimed limbs or blinded eyes?
The munitions made by the women at home were the vital engines for their men at the front line. But their effect on the individual mind could be shattering.
I marvel myself sometimes how human nerves can stand the strain of our existence. Day after day, night after night, hour after hour, a heavy shell falling every few minutes within a few yards of you, shaking the ground beneath you, half stunning you with the crash of the explosion.
The barrage was so great that it deprived one of thought, really.
Shrapnel.
The barrage was so great that it deprived one of thought, really.
Shrapnel on the barrage was terrible, terrible. How anybody ever survived it, I don't know.
I picked up a piece of shell about 2 inches long, half an inch wide, jagged edge to it, right in the groin. The doctor came along and he said, would you like me to take that shrapnel out? And the pain from it was terrific. And he said, no, before you say yes, with no anesthetic in the camp whatsoever. And I said, how long will you be? He said, well, about 2 minutes. So I thought for a minute, I said, go ahead with them. And in those 2 minutes, I could have killed that bloody doctor.
These massive artillery barrages brought a new phenomenon: shell shock.
My leave from the front in the last days of 1915 was a nightmare. My sleep was broken and full of noises and voices of the war. The voices were those of officers and men who were dead. One morning I was discovered standing up in bed, facing a wall, ready to repel an imaginary dawn attack. I had a real physical pain in my heart. I had loved many men and lost them.
Now, when you had shell shock, you just couldn't move. It seemed to take all the nervous system out of you. And if a fellow had shell shock and he couldn't go up that ladder, he was shot as a coward. He was no more a bloody coward than me.
The trenches produced something else that was new and terrible: poison gas. Chlorine was first used by the Germans in early 1915, soon to be imitated by the Allies.
The faces of the lads who lay in the open changed colour and presented a gruesome spectacle. Their faces and hands gradually assumed a blue and green colour. Many lay there with their legs drawn up and clutching their throats.
But just this tube which fitted your mouth, and you to breathe through this cloth, and then it took down in your neck so the gas couldn't get under. And that I only remember being in one gas attack, and that was enough for me. But I kept mine on. But it turned out after the one or two lads that they couldn't stand it any longer. They pulled it off.
My respirator fell to pieces with the continual removal and readjustment. The gas closed my eyes and filled them with matter, and I couldn't see. I were left lying in trench with one other gas man and various wounded beings and corpses, and forced to lie and spit, cough and gasp the whole day in that trench.
By 1916, this trench war had led nowhere. Both sides knew they had to do something. The Germans set their sights on the French fortress town of Verdun. The German commander-in-chief, General Erich von Falkenhayn, believed that Verdun was such an important symbol for the French that they would expend any number of lives to protect it.
His idea in attacking Verdun was not to take Verdun, but was to turn it into a kind of suppurating sore in which the French would feel they had to pour all their resources to try and hold this sacred city on the edge of their frontiers.
So the French fought for Verdun, and the Germans and the French became involved in one of the most appalling killing matches in history.
Falkenhayn had understood the French psyche. Henri Pétain, who would lead the defense of Verdun, saw it as a symbol of national pride.
Verdun is menaced, and Verdun must not fall. The capture of this city would constitute for the Germans an inestimable success.
On the 21st of February 1916, the German bombardment began. Pétain's troops lined up to resist.
My heart leapt as I saw our lads going into the furnace of Verdun. But I also reflected that they would pass too rapidly from the enthusiasm of the first engagement to the weariness brought by suffering.
Our time at Verdun has been awful. Our faces have nothing human about them. For 16 days we have neither washed nor slept. Life has been spent amongst the dead and dying, hardships of every sort and incessant anguish. Our cheeks are hollow, beards long, and our clothes thick with mud.
It was depressing to see the troops when they returned. Their expressions seemed frozen by a vision of terror. Their postures betrayed a total dejection. They sagged beneath the weight of horrifying memories. When I spoke to them, they could hardly reply.
Despite the German onslaught, the French resupplied the fortress week after week along a road that became known as the Sacred Way. Falkenhayn's plan was only partially working.
That Sacred Way became a kind of symbol of France's determination to resist. And so, even though he thought he could bleed France white, and he hit France very hard, he did not do so. He, in fact, roused French's patriotism to an extent that had never been seen before.
The Battle of Verdun went on until November. Each side suffered some 350,000 casualties. Of these, around 100,000 from both France and Germany were dead or missing. As Verdun ground on, France looked to her main ally for help. The British would attack the Germans at the Somme. The British intended that the Somme offensive would break clean through the center of the German line and lead to a rapid advance. Some men were told by their officers the artillery bombardment would be so enormous they'd only have to climb out of their trenches and walk through the opposition.
Rumour has it that we're going to smash the Hun line altogether, shove in our army and finish the war. Rumour also says that we have given Germany 4 days to declare peace or face the consequences. I'm not addicted to boasting, but I think if he could see all the guns behind, all the grenades, trench mortars and other stores in front, if he knew how thoroughly ready we are, the Kaiser would cut his losses and take poison.
The 7-day bombardment began on June the 24th. 15,000 guns lined up along a 20-mile front. The infantry waited.
My own sweetheart, before lying down I must send my wee girl a few lines. I got your letter today and you seem quite cheery. All my love, my darling girl, and keep a brave heart for my sake. And just pray that this war will soon be over and I can come back and take care of you and never leave you any more. All my love and lots of sweet kisses, Willie.
William Clark would die on the first day. Others, like Arthur Hubbard, would survive.
I hope we shall be successful on Saturday morning, July 1st at dawn, when you are all fast asleep, in driving the Huns out of their present position, and without any bad luck to myself. I can imagine how everything looks at home. The garden, as you say, must be almost at its best. You will soon be having beans, I presume. I'm your affectionate brother, Arthur.
They were massing to go over the top. Fateful words for all infantrymen. The timid were less fearful, the bold more exultant, and were thrilled and intensely alive as they fell in.
All around us and in front, men dropped and staggered about. A yellow mass of shrapnel would burst, and a section of men in 2 deep formation would crumple up and be gone. We led our section in and out of the stricken men, who were beyond help, or whom we couldn't stop to help. It seemed callous, but it was splendid war.
Kenneth McArdle would die on the Somme a few weeks later.
For many of the volunteers of 1914, this was their rite of passage. This was what they'd come to France to do, not to sit in trenches, but to beat the Germans at their own game. The trouble was it didn't happen as it was meant to be. On this beautiful July morning, attacking at 7:30 in broad daylight, the sight of men marching across no man's land, hopefully to take their targets at will, this was met by an absolute tirade, a torrent of machine gun fire from the other side.
The war on the Western Front was not even halfway through. Still, there was no breakthrough, only death. By the end of the first day of the Somme, 19,000 men on the British side were dead, a further 40,000 wounded. The worst day in the whole of British warfare.
The British, even if they had wanted to break off the Battle of the Somme after the disastrous first day, couldn't have done so, because it was necessary to fight on the Somme to relieve pressure on Verdun.
The strategic value of their sacrifice meant little to the soldiers on the Somme.
Dear Mother, just a few lines to let you know I am safe, and thank God for it. Mother, don't tell Quinn's mother, or Archer's mother, that they must be killed or Grosvenor Road fellow left but myself.
All the world is forever dead to Vaudry, Kenworthy, Chesham, Sproat, Ford, and of the other ranks we do not know how many. Young Victor was killed. His problem of marriage to a woman 6 years his senior finally settled. We're about 400 strong tonight, we who went in 800.
One particular casualty of the first day of the Somme was the concept of the PALS battalions. The PALS battalions Battalions raised locally in which lots of friends from football clubs, tennis clubs, dramatic societies, churches joined up as groups. This was going to be the great thing in 1914. In 1916, it became the great tragedy, because men who had gone together to fight had died together as well. And whole streets were plunged in the mourning.
On both sides, illusion was replaced by reality.
What was a man's life in this wilderness, where the air was laden with the stench of thousands upon thousands of decaying bodies? Death lay in ambush for each one, in every shell hole, merciless, and making one merciless in return. Chivalry here took a final farewell.
Not a tree stands. Not a square foot of surface has escaped mutilation. There is nothing but the mud and the gaping shell holes, a chaotic wilderness of shell holes, and in the bottom of many, the bodies of the dead.
The Germans, after the Battle of the Somme, said, we must save the men from another Somme battle. If the Somme battle was a trauma for the British, it was also for the Germans.
In the course of 4.5 months, the Allies advanced just 7 miles, with 600,000 casualties. German losses were just as great. The winter of 1916 was the coldest for many years. The ground remained frozen till April. Sickness in the trenches, trench fever, and dysentery rose alarmingly. But even during the lull, the killing did not stop. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, snipers, and small trench raids kept the casualty list mounting. Planning began for new big offensives in 1917. Both sides had to restock and bring in munitions. But for the soldiers in the trenches, what counted most were their few consolations.
There are two things that really, really matter to frontline soldiers, and that's food and their post. That really is the most important thing. And the British Army Postal Service was incredibly good. It really was. I mean, letters from the front line to home and back again were literally just taking about 2 days. I mean, that's better than the mail service can manage today.
They would send us parcels with cakes, mostly tins of things, like tins of coffee, tins of milk, condensed milk, or skim, the other milk that was very much popular at that time. Anything in a tin that would be useful to us would be sent, and we'd share it.
Socks. Well, if you had a pair of socks that had holes in, okay, socks were yours. And that's how we shared everything.
We shared our families as well. We would read one another's letters sometimes. I would be out, I was watching the 2 girls at that time.
As well as the men in the trenches, 1916 took its toll of the top brass. Von Falkenhayn was sacked for the failure at Verdun and replaced by Paul von Hindenburg and Erich von Ludendorff, who'd beaten the Russians back in 1914. They realized that the heavy German casualties of 1916 meant German forces on the long Western Front were now spread too thin. They constructed a formidable new defensive system called the Hindenburg Line, a 4-mile deep barricade of concrete fortifications. On the Allied side, the new British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, wanted to sack Douglas Haig, the architect of the Somme campaign, but Haig survived. His public standing was too high. The French, by contrast, sacked their commander, Joseph Joffre and replaced him with Robert Nivelle. Nivelle believed that an improved combination of continuous artillery bombardment and rapid infantry advance could rupture the German line. Nivelle decided to try out his theory in the rolling countryside of Chemin des Dames. His plan included a supporting attack by the British at Arras, which would start a week earlier and draw off German reserves. On the 9th of April 1917, the British attacked.
Tomorrow morning, early, we go over the top and hope to give the Boche hell. I have every confidence in my battalion. They will fight to the finish if necessary. I told them that there was only one good Boche, and that was a dead one. If only we could give the Hun a real good licking, I think he will be inclined to cave in.
The beginning of Arras was a pretty successful British attack. The Canadians took Vimy Ridge, and further south, some British divisions carried out the longest single advance in any day of trench warfare up to that point, about 3.5 miles.
But the British had not yet learned to follow up such a breakthrough quickly, and Arras turned into a month-long battle of attrition. Now it was the French army's turn at Chemin des Dames. But Nivelle's plan was flawed. For a start, he was careless about security, and the Germans got to hear of the operation. In addition, the German army was already withdrawing to its new defensive positions. This meant much of the ground Nivelle planned to take was now his anyway, and the new German line was immensely strong and overlooked the positions in which the French infantry and artillery would form up for their assault. On the 16th of April, the French attacked.
How we advance, how we get through, how we are not blown to pieces at every step, nobody knows. We stumble on, explosions everywhere, we fall flat, get up again, it's raining, we are swimming in mud. But we go forward in a hurry to escape this furnace, to get there at last, to find perhaps, worse still, it's impossible to get through this zone unarmed.
In one night, more cannon shells were fired than in any of Napoleon's campaigns. These men, exhausted, poorly fed, stuck in the muddy trenches, took the order to attack, grumbling to themselves, "Not everybody can be a hero."
The Germans had changed the pattern of defense. They left the front of the line relatively open, but behind, held in reserve, was their new idea. Stormtroopers waiting to go on the counterattack just as the French foot soldiers were reaching exhaustion. By the 5th day of Chemin des Dames, the stormtroopers had inflicted 130,000 casualties on the French.
The French army had already suffered the whole of the Battle of Verdun. Virtually every French soldier at some point had been put through the mill at Verdun. And then fairly soon afterwards, Robert Nivelle had come up with this wonderful offensive, the big Nivelle offensive, which was going to end the war in a hurry, which turned out to be an equally costly disaster. And the French soldiers had just had enough.
French soldiers began to mutiny.
Throughout the region, there is talk of nothing but mutinies, of troops refusing to relieve their comrades. It often happens that troops in the lines spend 3 or 4 days longer there because their replacements refuse to march.
The French mutiny did not bring violence against their officers or even a collapse in order. It was simply that the ordinary soldier was no longer willing to go on any more sacrificial advances. Robert Nivelle was sacked and replaced by the saviour of Verdun, Henri Pétain.
Pétain was brought in to sort out the mutinies by a combination of strict discipline, some executions, and also some decent caring for the soldiers, giving way to some of their demands. He brought the French army round.
Even so, the French army would launch no major attacks on the Western Front for a full year, staying mainly on the defensive. Pétain was concerned that the Germans would take advantage of the French collapse in morale, although inexplicably they failed to detect it. But it was now only the British who could take up the offensive. Haig planned a major attack for June at Messines Ridge, a stretch of high ground which commanded miles of countryside. He assigned Herbert Plumer, a very modern general, to devise the operation. Junior officers realized they were being led by someone who really knew his business.
Nothing was left to chance. We even had a large-scale model covering about an acre, which represented to scale the woods and the villages beyond. This latter was a triumph of skill. It looked like a huge toy village and would have delighted the children.
The Messines Ridge attack combined British, Australian and New Zealand troops. A potentially devastating weapon, the mine, laid by tunnellers, would be used en masse for the first time.
The tunnellers had possibly the worst job of all on the Western Front. Digging these narrow passages under the enemy lines in order to blow them sky high was a frightening business, because you knew the enemy was almost always... Digging these narrow passages under the enemy lines in order to blow them sky high was a frightening business, because you knew the enemy was almost always doing the same thing too.
The ordinary perils of mining under such conditions and with inadequate equipment would be quite enough for the ordinary man. But the tunneler had to face the opposition of the enemy as well as nature. A chance shell on the mouth of the shaft might arrest the flow of precious air, or mean condemnation to an indescribable death in a living tomb. More exciting, if no less unpleasant, was the prospect of running into an enemy gallery. The bravest men have confessed to nervous fears as they have crouched in a dugout, listening to the monotonous tapping of enemy miners below. So long as the tapping continued, there was safety. It was the occasional silences that were terrifying. Then the enemy might be charging his mine. At any moment might come death in its most horrible form.
On the 7th of June, 19 mines were ready to prime under Messines Ridge.
Dawn had not yet broken. The night was very still. The minute hand on my watch crept on to the fatal moment. Then, out of the silence and the darkness, along the front, 20 mines, some of them having waited 2 years or more for this occasion, containing hundreds of tons of high explosives, almost simultaneously and with a roar to wake the dead, burst into the sky with great sheets of flame developing into mountainous clouds of dust and earth and trees.
Silhouetted against the flame, I saw huge blocks of earth that seemed to be as big as houses falling back on the ground. I saw a man flung out from behind a huge block of debris silhouetted against the sheet of flame. Presumably some poor devil of a Boche. It was awful, a sort of inferno.
The British retook Messines Ridge and the commanding position it offered. The explosions were heard as far away as southeast England. At the end of July 1917, after their success at Messines Ridge, the British launched the Third Battle of Ypres, which would lead to Passchendaele. For 15 days, the German line was pounded.
With horror, you feel that your whole being, mental and physical, has lost all meaning. After all, the lump of metal that would crush you to a shapeless nothing may have started on its course.
The British went over the top on the 31st of July.
If only you could be here tonight, how you would enjoy it. Altogether, it should be great fun, as long as it doesn't rain.
But it did rain.
These were some of the most appalling conditions that soldiers had to fight in during the First World War. and historians have endlessly debated whether Haig was right to carry on fighting under these conditions. I suspect it's a case of Haig being damned if he did and damned if he didn't.
2 poor devils of 123rd Brigade have been found drowned, or rather suffocated. They must have been stuck in the mud, become exhausted, and fallen face forward.
Our boys are having a terrible time in the trenches, up to the waist in mud, just like a ditch full of water. There are dead horses, men, cars, motor lorries in the hundreds. It is death to go off the road as the mud is so deep. The sun was bad enough, but this is 1,000 times worse.
My 90th birthday, I was in the trenches in front of Passchendaele. The Germans at Passchendaele were higher up than us. They could look down on us. And there was a 3-day barrage on the trenches. They blew them all to hell. And when the Yorks and Lanks went over, expecting just a few Germans there, and were going to take Passchendaele, the Germans came up out of their dugouts, a couple of machine guns, woof, they were gone. The attack was called off. It was a disaster.
Poor little Shorty. He used to tell me about his young lady, his Hilda, about his home he had already bought. And when he got home, he would get married and come over to see me and introduce her to you. How he loved his Hilda, but unfortunately he'll never see her again. Poor fellow. He would give me half of everything he had. It's a lovely thing, his friendship out here. Please God, it won't be long before this war's over. We're pushing old Fritz back. I don't think he'll stand the British boys much longer, and then we'll try and keep a nice home. I'll know the value of one now. Good night, love. God bless you and my children, and may he soon send me back to those I love, is the wish of your faithful husband, Jack.
Jack Mudd died 4 days later. For some soldiers, the killing had gone on too long.
As that German came towards me, and I can't kill him, I mustn't kill him. I can remember when I joined the army, I swore I would serve my king and country. And by some means or another, it flashed in my mind when Moses came down off Mount Sinai, the 6th commandment he brought down, thou shalt not kill. And I can't kill him. I had about 5 seconds to make my mind up. I shot him above the ankle and above the knee. I brought him down. I didn't kill him.
Just 41 square miles were captured in 15 weeks. Each square mile cost some 10,000 casualties. But the British had also taken a huge toll of Germans.
At the end of the Battle of Passchendaele, in the first week of November 1917, I think any observer could have been forgiven for thinking that both sides were played out, that they had nothing left to give.
But there was a twist. A new weapon the Allies had been experimenting with for a year. The tank. Within a fortnight of the end of Passchendaele, the tank brought a dazzling victory at the Battle of Cambrai.
The British used tanks on a large scale for the first time, and just as importantly, they used predicted artillery fire. Now what this means is that they were able to start firing without firing a few shots to begin with to find out where the shells would land, and thus they were able to achieve surprise.
There was no preliminary bombardment to warn the Germans of their danger. The enemy infantry panicked and fled from the massive war machines, or streamed down the slopes towards the British line to surrender. We watched the scene, fascinated. Our tanks were now advancing. There they were, lumbering along, picking their way through the honeycomb of shell holes and craters, sometimes defeated, but generally in the end, winning their way through this area of devastation.
Tonight, I may sleep and dream of you where a Boche officer never dreamt of the trouble awaiting him at dawn. Think of the hundreds of tanks. Think of the hundreds of guns, all got up quietly and secretly. I can't get over the wonder of it.
11,000 Germans were taken prisoner. Cambrai was a complete success. Church bells were rung all over England in celebration. But to many soldiers at the front, it seemed an isolated victory. Though British morale would never break, it was at its lowest point.
The war is getting more and more desperate. On every hand one sees unrest and dissatisfaction rampant, and nothing sensible done to ameliorate grievances.
A more miserable existence would be hard to imagine. There's nothing but unrest and uncertainty, and everyone here is absolutely fed up to the teeth.
1918 loomed. The war on the Western Front hung in the balance.